Between 1774 and 1789, the men in the United States convened and held what was known as the Constitutional Congress. What came out of this was the Declaration of Independence, and that eventually led to the American Revolutionary War. Now, these men at the time were fighting for what they believed they didn't have from Britain, their rights and freedoms being recognized. And eventually, they went on to win the war and gain their rights and freedoms. During this time, women, of course, were not afforded the same political privileges as the men, but that didn't stop them from contributing to the new society. They wrote and educated and even served as political advisors. All the while, they still maintained their primary role as nurturers to their families. Now, during this era, it wasn't as if women didn't care about having political rights or a voice. In fact, many did, and one such voice was Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams was a future First Lady, and she told her then-husband, John Adams, who was a vice president, to remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Adams went on to become the second president of the United States and sadly forgot about the ladies. 144 years later, the suffragist movement, which began in Britain, played a big influence for the American women. And in 1912, they got the right to vote. However, again, this right to vote was really limited to just a certain group of women in the United States. There were still people who were left behind. And it wasn't until 1955 when Rosa Parks stood up and stood for her rights and freedoms as a Black woman and a Black American that the freedoms were then recognized for other minority groups. So you see that the female voice, when it speaks up and when it's heard, not only benefits women, but also men and minorities. Now, the challenge that we've had over time has been that occupations have really been limited for women. In this era, 38% of women were limited to 3 occupations: teacher, nurse, and secretary. 6% of women in America were medical doctors, 3% were lawyers, and less than 1% were engineers. And of course, it didn't help that there were common sentiments like this one expressed by a medical school dean. And he said, "Hell yes, we have a quota. We do keep women out when we can. We don't want them here, and they don't want them elsewhere either, whether or not they'll admit it." And it's sentiments like this that eventually led to the second wave of feminism during the 1960s and 1970s. Because in that era, even here in Ireland, women couldn't do things like own a house or go to a bar. And during that second wave of feminism, folks like Betty Friedman, as well as Gloria Steinem, stood vigilant and spoke for workplace inequality. What they cared about was reducing the gender gap when it came to pay and having rights to pursue any occupation. And thanks to their hard work, today we benefit from having that freedom. We can pursue a number of occupations, and we can pursue our freedom. Now, some might think, all right, that's great, so let's all go home. There's no more need to talk about this inequality between men and women. We all express a lot of great freedoms, and we all have occupations, and we all get paid for them. Well, if that's the case, then why do I still hear sentiments like this? I'm not going to put a woman on a panel or give her a speaking position just because she's a woman. We don't want to have a token. This sentiment isn't just true at conferences. It extends into the workplace and, unfortunately, into boardrooms. And of course, when women hear this, we think, I don't want to be a token. And some of us who are open to speaking might be reluctant to because we think, well, I'm also not an expert, so why should I bother speaking? No one's going to want to know about my experiences or hear my perspective. After all, I'm just a token. Well, I'm hoping that my personal stories will show you the power of one person's voice and one person's female voice. So back in 2008, I was building my first startup, Mint.com, where I was the founding engineer. And at the time, I decided to sign up and speak at a local code camp. I spoke about how I had built the prototype, I had launched it and scaled it to serving millions of people. And at the time, I spoke about the technology I was using, but I didn't really think anything else. And after I was done, kind of went about my life. Earlier this year, a young woman who was in the audience came up to me, and she said, "The talk that you gave back in 2008, it inspired me to join a startup. I thought if you could do it being a few years out of college, then I could too." And I did. So my little talk at a local code camp 4 years later, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years later, inspired a young woman to go out and pursue a career in a startup. And of course, there have been times where I've had to be that token. Back in 2013, I was invited to sit on a panel with 4 other men who were investors and entrepreneurs. And sure, I thought, why does anybody care about what I'm going to say? I'm going to be the only woman on that panel. It's not going to make a big difference. But it did, and it made a difference moments later. Another young woman came up to me and said, "Wow, I'm so thrilled to see that there are women engineers and entrepreneurs out there in the world like you. It makes me feel good about my decision to pursue engineering, and perhaps I'll rethink entrepreneurship as well." The conference organizers were smart to invite you to speak. So my plea to all of you is to speak. And I understand you might be shy, you might be introverted, you might think that you're not an expert in your field. But the truth is, even the small moments of speaking up in a meeting or an internal event or even a conference are going to make an impact and going to make a difference. And for those of you who care about amplifying the female voice, consider partnering with organizations like 50/50 Pledge, Innovation Women, Tech Speak Digest, and Write Speak Code, as well as my own company, Femgineer, which is an education company, and our whole goal is to educate, encourage, and empower techies to build companies as well as products. Now, I don't want to be known for having lived in an era where the female voice was stagnant. And I don't want to undo all the great work that the foremothers have done to give us this voice, to give us occupations, and to give us the freedoms that we enjoy today. So to all of you out there, please be the token and be proud of it. Thank you.
Want to be in the audience next time? Click here for tickets to Inspirefest 2017.